Welcome to you. Welcome to this meeting of the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. Our topic for today, Supersessionism, Nations, and Race. In a sense, this marks something of a departure from past sessions in that here we're asking so explicitly about crossover, about connections, about overlap of supersessionism and post-supersessionism, with another profoundly important topic, that of race. I want to give you briefly a sense of how our session will be organized today. I will speak for a very few minutes. Then what I would like to do is to introduce all three of our panelists very briefly. I will give each one of them an opportunity to make an initial presentation of about 20 minutes. And then what I want to do is return in the same order in which they spoke originally to give each of them an opportunity to respond to the papers that they heard from their fellow panelists. We will have a little bit of time at the conclusion for Q&A, not probably a large amount of time, but some. What I want to do is to ask that you post questions you have via the comments function in Zoom, and I'll plan to keep an eye on those. I believe that we will have too many participants to make it possible to recognize every question, but we will certainly get to the ones that we are able to recognize. And so to our introductions. First of all, the Reverend Dr. Daniel Lee is Assistant Professor of Theology and Asian American Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. 2020, Dr. Lee was also named Academic Dean for Fuller's Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry. Lee is the author of the book, Double Particularity, Karl Barth, Contextuality, and Asian American Theology, as well as many articles. Secondly, the Reverend Dr. Willie James Jennings is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana at Yale Divinity School. Dr. Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, published by Yale in the year 2010, has won numerous important awards, and frankly has become an indispensable touchstone for the topic that we will take up today. Finally, the Reverend Dr. Gerald McDermott. Dr. McDermott retired in May after serving 5 years as the Anglican Chair of Divinity at Stanford's Beeson Divinity School. This followed 26 years of teaching undergraduates at Roanoke College in Virginia. And after a number of other publications in retirement, Dr. McDermott is working on a significant publication modeled after the work of Jonathan Edwards' history of the work of redemption. So with that, I will turn in the order that I have just introduced our panelists and offer the floor to Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Coolman. So my paper is entitled Concrete Jewish Flesh and Concrete Humanity. Let me first express my gratitude to Dr. Ken Dosulan and the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology for the invitation to be part of this discussion. I'm honored to be part of this panel, and also I'm excited to share what I believe is a crucial aspect of our thinking about theological anthropology and more broadly, theological contextuality, or just generally how we should do theology. I want to also kind of do a shout out to my friends, Jen Rosner and Mark Kinzer. I think I've learned so much from them, and I think hopefully I will make them proud. And and if there are any mistakes, obviously this is all me. Let me start by talking about how we think about Christ. Truly God and truly human is how the Chalcedonian Creed of 251 grasps the person of Jesus Christ, beset by distortions that either sunder the mystery of the incarnation or deny its reality. This two-nature solution, both divine and human, guided the church amid its contemporary challenges back then. However, while it affirmed the humanity of Jesus as a general ontological category, this humanity lacked any material content. The Jesus of this and other ecumenical creeds and various confessions afterwards is only abstractly human, but not concretely so. While the historic events of the virgin birth by Mary, crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and the resurrection are all acknowledged, Jesus' Jewishness is nowhere mentioned. His concrete humanity as a Jewish Messiah is not a theological import, confessionally speaking at least. This omission is not simply accidental, but betrays a deeply rooted anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that took root from the early church onward. The concrete Jewish flesh of Jesus intrigues me as an Asian American theologian, which is to say, contextual theologian, or another word, a theologian, because obviously idea of particular social location and contextuality is a given for all theologians, whether situatedness is relegated only to contextual, non-white normative theologians like me, or haphazardly pays lip service to as a mere political correctness, or actually and explicitly acknowledged, we're all situated particularly. So in any case, as a theologian, one of my agendas has been that of theological contextuality, meaning contextuality based on the very being of God, as opposed to politics, culture, or anthropology. The idea is that the particulars of who we are matter to God and to God's interaction with us and with the world. For example, what is the place and significance of my Asian American identity in union with Christ? Who is Christ that I'm uniting with? In recovering Jewishness of Jesus, we establish his concrete humanity, not merely as an ontological category, but the embodiment of his particularities. And correspondingly, this has implications for our humanities. In this paper, I will first present the problem of essentializing Jewish flesh and various ways of abstracting it as theological concepts. Contrasting those reductions, a concrete definition of a dynamic, hybridic, heterogeneous Jewishness will be affirmed. Then, corresponding to this affirmation of Jewishness, I propose the importance of particular Gentileness and its socio-political, racial, and ethnic cultural matrix for theological contextuality and encountering with God. So, talking about essentialistic and abstract ways of thinking about Jewishness. Under the Third Reich, awakened to recover Jesus' Jewishness, Karl Barth asserts the idea of Jewish identity within the church. Barth proposes that Jews like Paul might not abandon Judaism because of their faith in Christ, but remain Jews, loyal and obedient members of Israel, the eternally elect people. While Barth lists the history of Jews as a sign and witness of divine providence, he puzzles over defining Jewishness. In terms of race, speech, culture, religion, and even history, Barth sees no unifying commonality, no essential core that can define the Jews as a single people. For example, there's no such thing as a pure Jewish blood or particular physical features. The Hebrew continues to serve as a cultic language, but the peoples of the Jewish diaspora speak many languages as their mother tongue. In terms of culture, again, the diasporic reality has led to various levels of assimilation and exchange with various national and regional cultures throughout Europe and beyond. In terms of religion, a person is still a Jew, whether his or her religion might be. And finally, the history of Jewish people is fragmented, again, with their diasporic dispersion. Barth concludes that ultimately, rather than any essential features, it is only the singular electing love of God that holds them together and sustains them. Jewish identity is a riddle physically, but only a witness of God's providence theologically. You can see how an essentialistic definition of Jewishness is too narrow, static, and thus problematic. But is this the only option? Does this spiritualized Jewishness end up being a phantom? Rejecting an essentialistic view of Jewishness is one thing. We also have a number of attempts of abstracting the meaning of Jewishness into general theological concepts. Here I present three interpretations of Jesus' Jewish flesh, one that's missiological, another one that's political, and a third racial. So first, from missiologist Andrew Walls and Lemming Sana, Israel and Jewishness represents a moment in salvation history, a particular beginning that serves as a model as we move toward a culturally pluralistic future. Walls organizes church history in 6 stages, starting with the Jewish age, moving on to Hellenistic, Roman, barbarian, and others. Wall's thesis that incarnation is translation leads to affirming that in Christ, God is translated into humanity, where true humanity must be particular in particular locality and particular ethnic group and particular space and time. Incarnation ends up the general missiological principle of particularity, but not a unique event regarding Israel, meaning that there are other incarnations when the gospel becomes flesh in new cultures and contexts. Similarly, Sana turns its attention to the nature of gospel message as cross-cultural transmissibility, where Jewish and Gentile encounter as a concept of missiological breakthrough, right? Where Jews and Gentiles become interchangeable. My fellow panelist, Dr. Jennings, points out a subtle form of supersessionism that exists here, where after Israel served its purpose as a source, there's no longer any use for it. The problem here is a functional erasure of Israel and Jewishness of Christ, and Jewish people as just one people among many. The danger here is that the abstract idea of Galah could simply replace the concrete Jewish people. The peace principle, similar to an indigenizing principle above. Third, along with the missiological and political abstractions, there can also be a racial instrumentalization of Jewishness. For example, in James Cohen's Black Jesus is such an interpretation of Jewishness in racial terms. Cohen's Christology is based on a dialectical affirmation of Jesus Christ in terms of his past, present, and future. Jewish Christ, Jesus of the past means Jesus of the present as Black, right? Because Jesus is a liberator of the oppressed and at the present, oppressed are Black. Jesus is the one with the least of these, and the least in America is Black people, therefore Jesus is Black. If seen in the context of the Black-white binary and the history of white supremacy, the existential and analogical idea of Jesus, Jewish Jesus as being Black is not only appropriate, but prophetic in its urgency. While Cohen offers theoretical nuances of what the symbolic Blackness means, I think more generally, Jesus being Black results in erasing Jewishness so that Black Americans take the place of Israel as the elect. While this is a potent anti-racist response to a white Jesus, Black Jesus suffers from a theoretical abstraction of Israel. J. Kevin Carter shares the pressing concerns regarding race and racism like Cohen, but recognizes the danger of losing Jewishness with Cohen's Blackness. Recognizing whiteness as an idol to thwart, Carter interprets Christ's Jewish flesh as covenantal flesh, into which Gentiles are received, making Jesus mulatto, multiracial, and intraracial. Within this multiracial body of Christ, the different bodies come together as one without losing their own particularities. By interpreting Jesus' Jewish flesh as covenantal flesh, Carter underscores a hybridic history of Jews in diaspora through the course of history with God. The boundaries of Jewishness are and have always been porous. Also in terms of Augustinian totus Christus, with Jesus as the head and church as his body, flesh of the Savior is indeed mulatto or intraracial. However, Jewish flesh here is in the danger of becoming an abstract concept of racial inclusivity, a form of instrumentalizing Jewishness that makes real Jews into abstract ideas. Among Asian American theologians, Sang Lee identifies liminarity in Galilean origins of Jesus. Galilee represents a land of political, cultural, and religious fringe. There is no theological significance to Jewishness of Jesus here. The concept of liminarity for Sang Lee, or for that matter, Jung Lee's marginality or Kwok Pilan's hybridity, are helpful tools. But again, they result in obscuring the Jewishness of Jesus as an abstract racial idea. As opposed to the missiological, political, and racial conceptualizations of Jewishness, Jewish theologian Michael Visegrad offers a carnal one that affirms the real existence of Jewish people. For Visegrad, the acid test of people's church's theological posture toward Israel's election is church's conduct toward Jews in its own midst, right? So Jewish Christians or Messianic Christians, right? Faith in Christ does not erase Jewish identity for the chosen people. Visegradian Jewishness is about the particularities of the physical body and the families that biologically connect to that body. Visegrad contends that Israel's election is a carnal election that is transmitted through the body. In this election, kinship is sanctified, not destroyed, but confirmed by placing it under divine services. Visegrad reminds us that Judaism rejects the bifurcation between spirit and matter. In that sense, Jewishness is about a sanctified peoplehood and of a national or ethnic identity as well. This thick Jewishness is about being a carnally elected people. Jesus' divinity is in this Jewish body with its familial, cultural, ethnic, and racial particularities. This flesh is not just a vessel or a husk of divinity that transcended the petty limitations of human distinctions. The meaning of Jewishness is found in these particularities, which cannot be reduced to theological concepts. Because being human means boundaries, distinctions, and limitations. There really is no such a thing as an abstract humanity. Everybody's human in a particular way. Whatever Jewishness means, be it particularity, people, peace, liberation, inclusivity, or even divine action, it cannot be less than this concrete carnality. Not only is the Jesus of past Jewish, the Jesus of the present and the future is as well. I mean, unless Jesus is no longer going to be human. This is a danger of kind of cosmic Christ. We can't affirm cosmic Christ without affirming Jesus' Jewishness. And any other Jesus other than this Jewish one who mediates the election of Israel for all as Gentiles to share in is not the Jesus attested in Scripture, not the incarnate God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, turning to the last section of concrete humanity. Affirming and protecting concrete Jewishness of Jesus in Israel means that Asian Americans and all non-Jews encountering God do so as particular Gentiles. This encounter has profound implications for the task of theology. This particular Jewishness of Jesus' humanity serves as a model and a mirror for our own concrete humanity. As a non-Jewish Jesus obscures the gospel and leads to a theological anthropology that is abstract and contextless, as well as corresponding soteriology has no real place for our human identities. On the other hand, a Jewishness of Jesus recognizes and affirms our Gentileness in its full particularity. Just as Jewishness cannot be essentialized or should not be distilled into abstract theological concepts, Gentileness must be affirmed concretely and carnally, including its familiar political, cultural, ethnic, and racial histories, as well as its particularities. Denise Duell reminds us that universalist claims can be liberating or oppressive depending on who's making them, in what context, and to what end. Too often we naively assume that erasure of difference in Christ means equality and freedom. Beleaguered by contemporary racism and tribalism, we can be tempted to escape the abstract universality that a post-ethnic Jesus offers. However, not only is this universal Jesus anti-Semitic in a denial of the specificity of revelation, it can also become a kind of imperialism that insists that we are all one and that demands the obliteration of difference. This Jewishness and corresponding Gentileness is concrete, but not essentialistic. There's an important distinction to be made here in that human particularity we're talking about is not essentialism. There's no eternal essence of Jewishness in terms of blood, culture, language, etc. Even the biblical witness testifying that there are no racial, ethnic, or biblical witness testifies that there are no racial, ethnic, or cultural purity of lineage. In case in point is the genealogy of Jesus that includes Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. But even without such essence, there is a carnal particularity of people with a particular family lineage and cultural, ethnic, racial, linguistic matrix, albeit fluid and hybridic identity. Our particularities, along with Jewish particularity, are never pure and could never be essentialized into one or two features. Nevertheless, the particularities, they still exist, and this hybridity still exists in particular historical contexts. In this sense, Revelation 7:9 should be read in this dynamic and hybridic manner. The great multitude that no one can count, from every nation, from all tribe, people, and language, must be read figuratively. Particular human distinctions are not eternal. Nations fall and rise, right? Rise and fall. Linguistic people groups are born and they also die. The United States did not exist a couple hundred years ago, and was born out of many nations, or people who call themselves now as Americans exist now, right? What they have, Americans speaking, they have ethnic heritages, many of them with multiple ethnic heritages, do not define their, these don't define who they are, right? Now we have this Americanness, which is actually another thing altogether. This eschatological vision of human diversity can only be read as an icon. What they're talking about in Revelation is an icon of multiplicity of human particularity, ever dynamic and fluid, and yet concrete for those who are living out these identities. In this sense, the distinction between race and ethnicity is moot. It is not the case that ethnicity is biblical and eternal, whereas race is secular and temporal. One is humanly created, other one is not. They're both human cultural creations of social meaning and identity. Even in the difference, we must contend with both culture, ethnicity, and race for our faith and discipleship. Israel's witness is wrapped up in the very being and revelation of God as the God of the covenant, God of history, the God of the incarnation, creation, and resurrection. This God is the God of I and thou relationality, where who we are in our particular time, space, and our particular bodies matter, as it did and still does for Israel. In that sense, corresponding to Israel as non-Jews, as Gentiles, but as a particular Gentile, my own particular time and space and cultural, racial bodies matter to God. Thank you.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much. And thank you for laying out some essential parameters for us as we begin our conversation. Dr. Jennings, I'm going to turn it right over to you without delay.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor Coolman. I want to thank you and Dr. Solon for this wonderful invitation. It's great to be on this screen and share this Zoom with Drs. Lee and McDermott. Thank you so much. My presentation, I hope, will be fairly short so that we can have as much time as we could possibly have for conversation. Title of my few comments are Supersessionism and the Racial Imagination. We cannot see the air we breathe until something makes it visible to us. Like stepping out into the cold, and there we see through our breathing what is always present to us and in us. Yet its visibility disappears as soon as we leave the cold and enter warm spaces where the breathing continues, but sight ends. It is this same elusiveness that greets us when we seek to understand the relation of supersessionism to the racial imagination. The racial imagination, which is the child of a diseased Christian imagination, grew at the sight of an absence. What was absent was any real sense of Gentile existence. That means that there was no sense of entering the story of another people. This was an entering that should have formed as a way of life. I will not rehearse what I lay out in great detail in my book, The Christian Imagination, but it does bear repeating that the modern racial condition forms as early European colonial Christians came to what was for them new worlds and showed who they understood themselves to be at the same time as they began to understand themselves differently. This twofold work of understanding cannot be overemphasized because it helps to situate the creation of a new optic bound up in a new form of subjectivity. That new subjectivity formed as a strange sort of centeredness. They, the colonialists, were the people of God, the central way through which God would do God's work in the world. The story of God in Scripture moved irreversibly toward them and inextricably through them into the world. Now, here we must understand supersessionism not first as a doctrinally articulated position, but a positionality that engenders a way of reading texts, interpreting doctrine, and forming Christian life. No Gentiles here in the colonial theater, only the one people of God. These people of God, however, were overwhelmed by the epistemological density of the New World, even as they came with incredible power, feverish greed, and the twin desires to possess/control and to know. They believed that God had given them the right and the responsibility to bring the new worlds to maturity, to mature the body, the soul, and the environment, and to make them all productive, able to yield their proper and full fruit in due season. This was a Christianity imagined as imperial teacher, tasked with capturing and covering the world in and with theological discourse. Through this process of teaching and understanding, racial vision forms in the claiming and naming of the new world. As I noted in the Christian imagination, the new thing here is the coalescing of many existing elements to form a new way of seeing, beginning with whiteness. Here we must understand that we are on the one field of cognitive and affective existence, a reality of thinking and feeling that is never, ever separated. Whiteness emerges as a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world at the same time. Whiteness emerges as a way of organizing the world, making sense of the world, and having the power to order the world by that organization. That organization also organizes feelings. That is, it creates an affective structure whereby a sense of well-being, of safety, of order against chaos, and progress all form through the practices, of order, which yield both a hermeneutic and add meaning to white subjectivity. That organization also formed a scale of existence with white at one end, the highest end of development and maturity, and Black at the other end. This is why it has never been very fruitful to think of race in terms of a white-Black binary. We are talking about a scale of existence in which and through which all people could be plotted in the imagination of these colonialists, that is, in the imagination of whiteness. Whiteness formed as a reconstructed identity that could and would construct identity. Whiteness is a modern race that constructed and sustains modern race. What makes this modern is not the use of white and Black to designate people. That's been around for a long time. But the removal of the land and water, animal and horizon, landscape and season, as those essential signifiers and speakers in the ways people spoke of themselves, and the turning of identity away from land that is now being stolen and inward from the body outward. The modern racial condition would not exist without this strange sense of centeredness born of supersessionism. Supersessionism yielded a racial optic that continues to this very moment, deeply embedded in Western societies and especially in the academy. The problem meets us in theological and biblical studies in two ways. First, we struggle to see how we see. We struggle to see how we see. The racial imagination permeates the way we conceptualize peoplehood, ethnicity, difference, and belonging. Supersessionism helped to form the optic that front loads the question: how should we understand the identity of Israel in relationship to the identity of the people of God? This is the wrong question. The question is not how do we identify Israel, determining the difference between biblical Israel, ethnic Jews, national or religious Israel in their diversity. The question is, what does it mean to be Gentile? And what is the calling unique to Gentiles in relation to the living of a faith that calls us toward joining? Yet beside our struggle with this imperial colonialist optic born of whiteness, we also struggle with acknowledging what we feel when we engage the problem of the racial condition. As I've said many times, whiteness feels. It has an affective structure. And scholars, just like everyone else, must deal with the feeling thinking matrix that comes with the racial condition. This is especially difficult for people who identify as white, because for so many have never faced the necessary negotiation of racial existence. Indeed, whiteness formed as a desired formation, calling all, especially immigrants to Western societies, to the identity to be achieved. BIPOC folks, in most cases, live that negotiation every day, struggling with and against desired whiteness and cutting space between who they are and the derogatory visions of a racial self. Yet this work remains largely denied and undone by so many white Western people, especially Christians, because whiteness formed as normative and positive, unless it's being questioned and decentered. To decenter whiteness requires we understand its supersessionist underpinnings and sensibility. Yet this work also requires we make visible not a doctrine, supersessionism or white supremacy, but a way of life that is energized by both. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings. I was transfixed there for a moment. Okay, what I want to do is, again, without delay, turn to our third presentation. And so, Dr. McDermott, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and jump in.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you to the committee, and thank you, Daniel, for the privilege of joining this panel with Professor Jennings and Professor Lee. The title of my paper is Supersessionism the Source of Race? ? The connection of supersessionism to the modern idea of race has most famously been proposed by our colleague, Willie Jennings. Professor Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination, 2010, is perhaps the best known articulation of what I will call the origin of race as supersessionism thesis, or ORS for short. 2 years before The Christian Imagination appeared, J. Cameron Carter made a similar proposal. Still others have posited links between supersessionism and race thinking. But in this talk, I will focus on Professor Jennings' version of the proposal because it's perhaps the most developed and the most influential. First, let's trace briefly the shape of ORS as delineated by Professor Jennings. ORS sees a mutually reinforcing symbiosis of capitalism, nationalism, racialism, and colonialism. The intellectual soup in which these four elements congealed into a thick compound was supersessionism. This was the replacement of Israel's chosenness by God with God's new relationship to the nations, where Israel was irrelevant. Before the replacement, the nations were invited to find God by relating to Israel. But now, God's special relationship to Israel was replaced by God's universal sameness of relationship to the nations. And by this replacement, a womb for whiteness emerged that became the only way to mature. Supersessionism was now the glue that attached Christianity to whiteness. It came to the fore at a moment in human history when the world was opening up to Europeans. It was the first time in human history that peoples were forced to think of themselves away from land and animals, as Professor Jennings just mentioned, and identified instead with racial bodies. Spanish blood purity laws were used to eliminate the taint of Jewish blood, one drop of which would contaminate a person and family. The idea of race as biological stain that determines the thinking and being, moved from Jews to Blacks and cemented the correlations of colonialism and capitalism and nationalism and racialism in unprecedented ways. This also enabled Christian theologians to connect their supersessionist views of Jesus as God-forsaken ones, their supersessionist view of Jews as God-forsaken ones to Blacks as God-determined inferiors suited to slavery. This is a historical argument with explanatory power. It helps answer questions about the persistence of white Christian racism toward people of color over centuries. By linking this racism to a newly discovered problem in the history of Christian thought, supersessionism, it suggests a kind of Rosetta Stone that promises to decipher hitherto hidden mysteries in theology and history. But is it true? Was it really supersessionism that provided the theological impetus to connect historical phenomena in such a way that modern racism then emerged? Was supersessionism necessary to produce this final product so that apart from it, race as a modern concept would not have resulted? Let's begin with the question of whether there was a sudden reemergence of supersessionism just before or at the rise of European colonialism. The short answer is that there is no hard historical evidence that supersessionism was newly prominent in this period. It had been around the church since the Epistle of Barnabas at the end of the first or near the beginning of the 2nd century CE. It was prominent in the writings of Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century and became normative doctrine after Constantine in the 4th century. So it was already routine more than 1,000 years before European colonialism. No clear evidence appears in the Christian imagination of its role in the onset of race as a modern concept. Now we are told that the 16th century Jesuit, Alessandro Valignano, his derogatory use of black, that word, was informed by his supersessionism, but no evidence of that connection appears in the text that I can find. We see that Anglican bishop in South Africa, John Colenso, denied Jewish presumption of divine privilege, but nowhere are we shown any connection between this conventional supersessionism and Colenso's initial support for the colonial project. No, in fact, we are shown that Colenso wound up fighting the unthinking cruelty, those are Colenso's words, of British colonialism and felt, quote, bound to the flesh and plight of the African. Those are Professor Jennings' words. The third poster child for ORS is said to be hymn writer Isaac Watts, who allegedly replaced the story of Israel with the story of Britain and racialized the latter. Now, evidence proffered is Watts's version of Psalm 47, which in the Bible says that the Lord loved Jacob and reigns as king of all the earth. Watts's rendition inserts Jesus our God in place of the Lord and says that, quote, in Israel stood his ancient throne. He loved that chosen race, but now he calls the world his own and heathens taste his grace, close quote. Now it adds that, quote, the British Islands are the Lord's, close quote. Watts's poem in Psalm 114 rehearses the Exodus and the entry into the land across the Jordan by miraculous partings of waters, then concludes that miracles in nature in his own land are the work of the God of Israel. Quote, let every mountain, every flood retire and know the approaching God. The King of Israel, see him here, tremble thou earth, adore and fear. Now, does Watts erase Israel as Professor Jennings says? No sign of it here. Watts does create a kind of parallelism between Israel and Britain, as Professor Jennings notes, but that's no different from the legions of Christian thinkers for the 17 centuries before Watts, who wrote of God dealing with whole nations in ways similar but not identical to his dealings with Israel. Professor Jennings charges that Watts's commitment to the God of Israel working in Britain's history is racial because Watts's nationalism is about territoriality, and all territoriality, Professor Jennings says, produces space upon which racial being functions. Yet the evidence for such racialist belief in Watts, I find, is missing from Professor Jennings' account. Now, if the rise of race as a modern concept depended on supersessionism, why does supersessionism play little or no explicit role in the ORS narratives of these colonialist exemplars? Proponents of ORS might point to the Spanish pure blood laws and argue that they were integral to modern race thinking and depended on supersessionist thought. Yet the preeminent historian of race and slavery, David Bryan Davis, has argued that the origins of anti-Black racism in the New World lay in a complex mix of factors. Fairly universal stereotypes of slaves and peasants, color symbolism going back to the ancient world, Islamic slavery and color coding from which Christians learned, changing interpretations of the curse of Ham, and connections between Spanish fears of blood contamination with Jews that were then transferred to Blacks. So Davis acknowledges that the Spanish blood purity laws played a role. Yet according to Jerome Friedman, these laws were occasioned primarily by economic competition between new Christians, and they were Jewish converts, and old Christians. Religious fanaticism stemming from the reconquest of Spain from the Moors, and popular allegations that the Jews were to blame for the plagues of the 14th century. Now, supersessionism undoubtedly had been assumed by Spanish Christians for more than a millennium, but the new developments stimulating blood purity laws seem to have been economic, political, and mythical rather than religious or theological, such as a new emphasis on supersessionism. Let's return to another heuristic question. Was the notion of race as skin color new to the colonialist period? The notion of skin color as designating a different kind of being is more modern than ancient or medieval, but discrimination based on skin color goes back almost as far as we can trace. Davis reports that in the second and first millennia BCE, the North Chinese referred to the naked and primitive barbarians of the southern islands as Black and considered them inferior. In ancient India, slavery was initially associated with the dark-skinned Dravidians conquered by the lighter-skinned Aryans from the north. Although ancient Greeks and Romans did not develop a biological and therefore deterministic theory of race, they tended to favor lighter skin. In medieval Western Europe, serfs and peasants were depicted as subhuman and Black because of their sun exposure and their immersion in soil and manure. Even in Scandinavia, medieval writers expressed contempt for supposedly dark-skinned serfs and slaves. Now, David Goldenberg reports that black-white symbolism representing evil and goodness is found in China and South Asia. It's found among Sino-Tibetan people, Mongolians, Siberians, and Creek Indians in North America. He finds it in Sanskrit, Caledonian, and Japanese literature. Anthropologists report that it is common in Black Africa. The association of blackness with slavery seems to have first arisen after the 7th and 8th century expansion of Islam. Islamic writers linked blackness to slavery from as early as the 7th century and reinforced it with references to Noah having cursed his son Ham with both slavery and black skin. By the 10th century, blackness and slavery had become synonymous in Muslim cosmology. Arabs and their Muslim converts were the first to make use of millions of blacks from sub-Saharan Africa and to begin associating Black Africans with slavery. According to some scholars, as many Black slaves were imported to Islamic lands over 12 centuries, starting in the 7th, as all the African slaves transported to the New World. Medieval Arabs and Persians came to associate the most degrading labor with Black slaves, and more Muslim writers describe Blacks in terms befitting Aristotle's image of natural, so-called natural slaves. So Ibn Khaldun, for example, the 14th century Tunisian historian, wrote that Black people are on the whole submissive to slavery because they have little that is human and are more like dumb animals. Davis, James Sweet, and other historians have concluded that racial stereotypes were transmitted from Muslims to Christians during the centuries when Christians traded with and fought Muslims, from the Byzantine through the modern periods. Muhammad was a slaveholder. Since Islamic law forbade enslaving Muslims or Christians or Jews, slaves had to be found elsewhere. Until the late medieval period, that was north of the Mediterranean and south of the Sahara. Davis thinks it's highly probable that as Spaniards and Portuguese became familiar with Muslim writings on Black slaves, that they transferred to Blacks the kind of racial ideas originally ignited by their hostility toward Jews who had converted to Christianity. George Frederickson suggests that Muslim writings were influential because of Muslim practices. Quote, in southern Iberia, the most conspicuous slaves of light-skinned or tawny Moorish masters were Black Africans, and it was natural for Christians as well as Muslims to begin to associate sub-Saharan African ancestry with lifetime servitude. So let's take stock of my argument so far. Supersessionism was not integral to the leading character's racism in the ORS narrative, and there's no evidence that supersessionism was newly prominent during early modern European colonialism. The blood purity laws of the Spanish Inquisition might suggest supersessionist roots in Christian hatred for Jews, but their etiology seems to be connected more with economic and social competition than supersessionism per se. The period of European colonialism was not the first time that skin color was used to evaluate human beings on a scale where lighter is preferred to darker. In fact, it seems to be a constant in history. Finally, while Christian racism is abhorrent, Christians have not had a corner on this evil. The association of slavery with dark skin and judging that skin inferior seems to have been learned by Christians from Muslims. And so in sum, ORS cannot be sustained as a historical argument. My second question is whether ORS advances human flourishing. Since it's about race and racism, does it contribute to a reduction of racism? Let's look first at what ORS means by race. Professor Jennings claims that race in ORS is not really about skin color, and you just heard him talk about that. He says that no one is biologically white, so there's no white biology. Whiteness does not refer to people of European descent, but to a way of being in and seeing the world, as he has just explained to us. Therefore, he admonishes his readers, he is not an advocate of race. One might conclude that ORS, therefore, is not about skin color at all, but a way of being in the world that can be seen in all skin colors. Yet in the ORS narrative, nearly all descriptions of blacks are neutral or positive, and all references to whites and whiteness are negative. We read that the only concept that links different identities of peoples is race, which is signified in its always present facilitator, whiteness. Colonialist dominance is still the preserve of Western white male identities. Religions, races, and nations were created in the operation of whiteness. He says that ORS wants to save us from being or becoming white people. A black woman who owned slaves is said to be a white Negro woman. Whiteness means refusing to place yourself in the journey of others, refusing to be centered from below rather than from the towering heights of whiteness. Only whites touch others to feign sympathy, but fail to listen. This begs the question, if whiteness is not about biology, then why are white skins uniformly associated with bad things? And why are victimhood and virtue reserved only for those with black skins? So that even when it's allowed that Africans enslaved fellow Africans before the colonial period, African slavery is quickly dismissed because it operated, quote, under the humane conditions of the kinship network, close quote. What about the African slave traders who sold fellow Africans to Europeans into horrific slave networks? And that would be the case for nearly all the Africans who came into the hands of European slavers. Are the African slavers to be considered white because of their cruelty toward fellow Africans? What is racism? Benjamin Isaac defines its essence as identifying an individual exclusively as representative of a group, so that the individual is assumed to bear all the characteristics of the group. The flip side of this is that the group is treated as a single individual whose varied individualities are then ignored. The distinctive qualities of the supposed group are thought to be permanent and unalterable by the willed efforts of a member of the group. Direct connections are made by races between physical traits, such as skin color, and mental or even moral qualities. A final part of the basic definition is a presumed hierarchy in which some races are thought to be superior to others, with one usually being at the top. So where does this leave ORS? Well, unfortunately, because it associates immoral behavior and perception with the color white, it suggests a moral hierarchy of color in which white's on the bottom. Since the bad actors in its historical drama are all white, this implies that bad behavior typically goes with white skin. The association of color with biology is strong and nearly unvarying, despite the insistence of ORS that it's not about biology. So the bad news is that ORS, in its laudable attempt to expose racism based on skin color for its moral evil, sadly suggests a new racism based on skin color. Now, ORS is to be praised for its efforts to increase human flourishing, but one must conclude that it has taken a step backward rather than forward. And oddly, ORS teaches its own supersessionism. One of Professor Jennings' more recent books is After Whiteness, a treatise devoted to theological education. Here, he exhorts us to find the being beyond the white self-sufficient man. Now, of course, from a theological perspective, there's a certain problem with total self-sufficiency in the face of the all-powerful God of Israel. But why is self-sufficiency white? Is there no black self-sufficiency? The book praises a black student who reads only black authors. Here, the meaning of black clearly refers to skin color. One could be forgiven for concluding that ORS has now moved to a racial supersessionism in which blackness is meant to supersede whiteness. Whiteness is a collage of everything blind and bad, while blackness is the color of goodness and perception. Since repeatedly in these narratives, whiteness is said to be the way of being and seeing of white people, and even black people who go astray are said to be white, readers might not be wrong to infer that this is a new time in history when black people are meant to supersede white people. The political and social implications of such a logic are disturbing. So ORS fails as a historical hypothesis. It has not argued convincingly that supersessionism was the lever historically that set modern notions of race in motion, nor has it succeeded in moving forward the moral march of history that racism has crippled. Let us not go backward to a one-dimensional view of race, but forward to an enriched and more deeply theological discussion of what has divided us. And let us use the history of supersessionism in a way that could be more constructive. For example, we could start with the false notion of Judaism as a race and explore the ways that understanding the Jewish people as a genealogy rather than a race will help us better understand not only human beings, but the modern social construct called race. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. McDermott. So we're looking at some sharp disagreement in this session. I wonder if we could now return. What I'd like to do is to give each one of our panelists a few moments to respond to what they've heard. I will invite participants also to share questions, again, via the comments function on Zoom. That'll give me an opportunity to receive those. And so looking to the same order, I'd like to turn to Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Coolman. My responses. Thank you, Dr. Jennings. Thank you, Dr. McDermott. Appreciate the questions and the comments, and then we appreciate the papers. Obviously, Dr. Jennings, I'm sure you see elements of my appreciation and indebtedness to your ideas. So I think that's pretty clear. So given that, specific aspect of you talk about the need to go beyond and how the black and white binary paradigm of race is problematic, obviously, right? And I think the question that I have is the concrete manifestation of this rejection. Would it not be to not continue the rubric of thinking about race discussion in the discourse in a narrow black and white way? Because I think you're rejecting it, but at the same time, I think it perpetuates it because that's how it's framed. For example, like narrative is not just black and white. I mean, even in terms of crystallizing white supremacy and white normativity in the US, books like Ian Lopez's White by Law shows that legally what constituted white was refined against Asian bodies, right? And this is obviously, not lost to you, but I think sometimes the narrative ends up being, even as we're undermining it, ends up kind of refining and continuing on the black and white binary, which I'm trying to figure out, how do we do that, right? How do we do that? And I think in another sense, it can kind of happen when when I feel like when race ends up becoming kind of like a totalizing category. Now, I'm absolutely on board with you as far as race becoming this immersive as the air, right? Same page, right? So yes, we totally get that. But how do we make sure that there actually is room? And maybe it's because that's the subject of how you're trying to address it. I'm not sure if it's how or if it's actually what you're trying to address, but what about the other categories? Like for example, as an Asian American, distinction between ethnicity and race is actually quite important. Sorry. And calling me Asian American is one thing, but confusing my Korean heritage with with Chinese or Japanese would be a kind of an act of erasure, right? So how do we make sure there's room for that? So that, and I think race, as you know, can actually cover everything because some people use it that way. But I think that's actually a problem as well. Talking about race as just a way of human distinction, that actually ends up being kind of reductive. And so that's basically a concern I think I have. I think the idea of kind of having multi-layered matrix without taking anything back from the structural and systemic aspect of race, because that's, once again, we're on the same page as far as that goes, but talking about that along with race and, right, adding different aspects of it would be beneficial even for the Black community, right? So, because that would actually have an idea of distinguishing what is shared, what is not shared, between categories of Black as opposed to kind of Black Americans in the US, as opposed to Somalian refugees, as opposed to immigrants from Nigeria that's coming on. So racially, obviously, they all share, and they were part of this kind of a whole optic kind of regime. Absolutely, right? Nothing as far as taking, but how do we make sure that that doesn't become totalizing? I think that's a concern from my perspective. And also, you come to this this affirmation of theological meaning of being particular Gentiles. I mean, I think that's really what I appreciate so much, that this is really important, us affirming our particular Gentileness. But I actually don't think we can actually get there without defining what Jewishness is, right? And what it means. And this is where I really agree that sometimes idea of defining Jewishness is just another expression of supersessionism, right? We kind of, it's like we explain it away as though there's nothing there, right? So, how do we kind of make sure that because it's going to end up becoming a mirror. It's going to end up having a correspondence to how we think about ourselves, this Gentileness. In that sense, I see that as really significant. How do we kind of grasp it and not avoid supersessionism in how we define Jewishness, so that in turn, we can kind of get to the meaning of particular Gentiles. So hopefully that kind of makes sense in terms of what I'm trying to get at and what I'm concerned about. As far as Dr. McDermott, I mean, largely the paper is not directed toward me, so I'll comment on two things and kind of leave the rest of it to Dr. Jennings. I do, specifically, in terms of your concern about whiteness and how whiteness works, I have been concerned, I mean, not only in particularly Dr. Jennings' work, but in other cases where how sometimes whiteness kind of functions. It actually ends up being jack of all trades. It ends up doing too much, carries too much burden, because it's actually serving in multiple ways, the word white and whiteness as well. It ends up being kind of an insider talk, because obviously it's not just Dr. Jennings' work. This is not his words. This is a body of work that talks about whiteness, critical white studies. So it's actually something that's broader. And as an insider talk, it's not conducive to clear communication, because I can distinguish how it's being used because I'm familiar with the whole body of work. So, but in another sense, because it's not clear communication, it's doing too much work. In my work, I've tried to make sure that I use actually more specific words, right? So not to avoid miscommunication, I would use white normativity or structural racism, or structural whiteness. How do you make sure that we distinguish these things so that we're not talking about, when you say all white people are not white, we're talking about a mentality, like once again, a particular hermeneutic and an optic that's actually slightly different than physical features, but the word itself is doing multiple things. So I share that. Like, for example, Michael Morris's article, Standard White, where really defines white normativity as opposed to white supremacy. I find it to be incredibly helpful. And even at Fuller, that's the language we use, because we realized whiteness was just too abstract sometimes. Yeah, and then I think that I think questions. First question is, so you're critiquing OSR, but I'm not sure if the critique is OSR or the idea of structural racism in general, because I think at points it kind of gets become conflated. I think without OSR, I think there's still plenty of reasons, political, legal, and structural explanations of how racism works. And I think even without a theological understanding, we need to take that on. So even with the OSR, it doesn't necessarily mean because OSR ends up being weak that we don't have reason to talk about race and racism. And I think that gets conflated in your argument. So that's kind of a concern from my perspective. And also, this is actually, so this is where I absolutely agree with you, right, Dr. McDermott, about this genealogical understanding, because that's basically what Visegrad and other people have talked about. And there's something really concrete here that I think has to be affirmed. But dichotomizing genealogical versus racial understanding of race seems odd. I mean, of Jewishness, it seems a bit odd to me and a bit restrictive, because throughout history, Jewishness was considered a racial category, and race is something that we actually have to all contend with. So our identities and even Jewishness is not just formed internally, how we think about it from the inside, but also societally, right? From a structurally, from a political perspective. In that sense, a Jewish racial understanding of Jewishness would have to be one of the features as well. I think, once again, I talked about the fact that if it totalizes the whole conversation, I think it ends up being problematic. But as one element of it, I think is really, really important. So those are my comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Dr. Jennings, we'll go to you, and I would just point out that we're actually doing fine for our schedule. Unusually, we're not behind at all. So, so don't feel that you have to hurry with your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor Coolman, and thank you, Drs. Lee and McDermott, for your wonderful papers. Really appreciate what you've been saying, both of you have been saying. So just a few thoughts for our conversation. Dr. Lee, I appreciate very much the question about how do we think about race, not caught in the problems of the white-black binary. And I think the challenge for us is to discern more carefully what are the particular intellectual tasks ahead of us as we think about this matter of race. And so let's think about this at three levels. So there is a task of understanding of, and by me talking about the plotting, it's here to understand our particular stories and how those stories engage inside that reality of plotting from black to white. Black to white, understood as a scale, means that people can be plotted and then asked to move their lives toward whiteness. And I think that's part of trying to unearth the stories of so many people in the West, trying to figure out who they are. And so I think that's one kind of intellectual task that's important. How do we understand our stories in relationship to this reality of plotting? But then there's a second, I think, task, and that is, how do we articulate to ourselves who we are? And how does that articulation then work in how we want to be spoken to out from those outside? And that self-articulation is complex. And that self-articulation comes back to what you were saying, I'm Korean, don't just call me Asian, and I'm trying to, in a sense, articulate to myself what that means in relationship to the ways in which the racial optic works. But then there's a third task, and here I think we often fall into some very serious confusion. It's a political task. And in the West, especially in this country, understanding this political task is very important, and that is discerning the uses of the racial logic. The uses of the racial logic. This country is shaped inside a profound racial antagonism. And we have to understand the uses of that logic, which is a different matter than those other two. They're related. And we can't collapse them all into one intellectual task. Trying to discern how people use the racial antagonism that is shaped around white and black, and that is shaped around a particular ongoing narrative of what the West, who owns the West and what the West is for. It's really important. But let me also talk about this matter about whiteness, and this is always a more complicated matter. We stand in a history where people who have been identified and identify themselves as white have never, ever, for the most part, engaged in that important work, that important thing I mentioned in my paper, of discerning the difference between whiteness and who they are. So now for every other people of color, for every BIPOC people, and as I mentioned in my paper, this is standard work of discerning the difference between who one is and the derogatory racial self, and pulling from that the little slivers of truth that tie to the historical existential realities of who we are, pulling that from, And so that who I am can be made clear to me and clear to the world. And that work of negotiation is crucial. But whiteness has always been presented as wholly positive and wholly normal. And so for so many people to even say the word white is already bordering on hate speech, because they've never had to imagine a difference between who they are as people and whiteness. Now, what has been the heroic genius and miracle of so many people of color is that they've had to redefine that reality, that racial reality, and to try to make it something that it was not, that is positive. So the positive use of Blackness, the positive use of a racial identity, to trying to make something out of what was absolutely horrible. This is a part of the historical struggle. But I think if you would ask anybody historically, even at this moment, would you prefer to not have to do that work? Would you prefer to have simply be known by your people in the place in which your people form? I think most people would say, yeah, that would have been preferable, but this is the work that's been given to me. That work remains undone, and in many ways denied by so many people who are white. And so that is a crucial challenge, and that cannot be massaged. It has to be faced. That work has to be faced. And so whiteness cannot simply be offered with multiple distinctions without recognizing that there's incredible work that has to be done in order to make those distinctions intelligible, right? We've come to those distinctions through the hard work of trying to work through the derogatory. And so you can't simply, as I say, you can't simply save people from the work that they need to do. Dr. McDermott, thank you so much for your struggling with my work and struggling with these matters. It was unfortunate that in your presentation, you didn't spend any time with the Untitled Chapter. And I guess I'm wondering why you completely bypass an entire chapter. And that chapter does a really good job of addressing almost everything you raised. But I do want to come back, I think, to one of the most crucial points. Again, I've already mentioned this thing about whiteness, but I also want to come back to this crucial point about what supersessionism is. Clearly, it would be a mistake to see that I'm saying that supersessionism reemerges. What I'm saying is that supersessionism is already a fundamental part of the very posture through which these early European Christian settlers saw the world. And supersessionism here is a positionality of centeredness that teaches them to teach the world that they, the Europeans, are the people of God, and that they are inviting all who they encounter into the truth of life with God. That's a different matter than saying that supersessionism emerges at this particular time in history. I think what's also important to remember as we look at this is that, and I said this in my paper and I say in the book, white and Black do a different work at this moment historically than what you accounted. And I appreciate you looking back at the same sources I looked at, but it's doing a different work that I think most historians recognize. We're not talking about white and Black simply as a kind of logic, derogatory logic in relationship to various peoples. We're looking at white and Black taking on a new role in classification and categorization, and in making sense of a new reality of multiple peoples. And so in that regard, it's not helpful, I think, to look backward and ask about white and Black. It's more important to look forward and see the work that white and Black does. But in this regard, here's what I think what's also important. white and black is being deployed at the same time that a new reality of whiteness is emerging. That's why I'm saying whiteness is a way of being seen in the world and a way of seeing the world at the same time. That's what makes it so complicated. And that way of seeing, and this one other thing I'm just reiterating what I said in my paper, that way of seeing the world also has an affective dimension. It also has a dimension of how one feels as one sees. And the difficulty of having others look back at the scene and say, there's something wrong in the way you see, and having to deal with the feelings of having that recognition brought to a way of recognizing. And that, I think all those together constitute, in many ways, the very complicated matter of unearthing what's really at stake here, and why supersessionism is such a significant problem, because it really echoes, it really builds from a particular way of reading the Bible, and a particular way of seeing who's at the center of the story. Supersessionism, as it forms whiteness, positions these early European Christians precisely in the same position as Israel in relationship to the overall sweep of the story. They are at the center of the story of God. And so when we come to the colonial moment, these early European Christians, they move to the very center of the story of God. And that centering becomes, in a fundamental way, whiteness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings, and I'll give an opportunity to Dr. McDermott, if you could respond.
Sure. Thanks, Holly, and thank you, and thank you, Professor Lee and Professor Jennings. It's been good. You know, Daniel, if I may call you that, and please call me Jerry. I really appreciated your paper. Your emphasis that Jesus's Jewishness is a concrete particularity that cannot be reduced to a theological concept or abstraction. One question I would have for you, and you know, by way of comment, is that I was struck by your statement that ethnicity is biblical and eternal, while whereas race is secular and temporal. Now, actually, I agree with you on that. I totally agree with you on that, because I believe that race is a social construct, as Professor Jennings, I think, does too. So I would affirm you in that. But the tension that I saw was with your later statement that particular human distinctions are not eternal. You know, and you use the example of different nations that, you know, empires that no longer exist, and, you know, the United States. I wonder how far you want to push that. And I wouldn't think that you would want to push that very far, that particular human distinctions are, you know, a distinction is not eternal. For example, Jew and Gentile are not Jews and Gentiles, still Jews and Gentiles eschatologically. Males and females are not males and females, still male and female eschatologically. You know, and what about that oft-cited text in Revelation 7, the one that you cite? This seems to be John's portrait of the eschatological people of God, from every tribe, nation, people, and language. They seem to be still distinguished in those four ways eschatologically. So I see that as a certain tension. I liked almost everything else in your paper, but it seemed that you were sort of shooting yourself in the foot at the end by making that statement that particular human distinctions are not eternal. And then let me get to your questions to me. You thought that I was conflating ORS, the origin of race and supersessionism, with the structure of racism in general. Maybe I was, I wasn't. I don't think I was. I would certainly say the structure of racism in general is a completely different question. That's a different problem that needs far more investigation. And then you questioned about, you had a comment about my last suggestion at the end of the paper, that we should look at Jews as a genealogy and not as a race. And you thought that that was constricted because Jews have been thought of as a race, for so long, historically. And I guess my response to that is they've been thought of wrongly. They should not be thought of as a race because Jews are not a race and never have been from the first day when Abraham circumcised his servants, who probably were not of the same, what we would say, ethnic background as he. The mixed multitude coming out of Egypt probably had many different colors if we use the modern concept of race. You go to Israel today, you see black Jews and white Jews, you see brown Jews, you see yellow Jews. Jews are not a race and they never have been. And so I think that's actually a very harmful way of thinking of Jews and Judaism. And to think in terms of what Mark Kinzer has suggested, Jews as a genealogy, I think is far, far better. And I think that, well, as I said at the end of the paper, I think that thinking of people groups in terms of genealogy rather than color of skin is a constructive way to go forward. And I think all the emphasis upon whiteness and blackness that just in the very language suggests focus on color of skin and typecasting people by their color of skin, I think is the wrong way forward. And I think does more harm than good. So to Professor Jennings now, I appreciate your generosity. Willie, if I may call you Willie and call me Jerry. I appreciate your generosity and your graciousness in calling my paper a wonderful paper that challenges you. That's extremely generous and extremely gracious. Now, you say that my basic, criticisms would have been undermined if I had dealt with Acosta. I didn't see a strong connection with supersessionism to his racism in that chapter. Now, if it's there, I'd like to see it, but that's why I didn't proffer him as one of the examples, because his supersessionism as motivating his racism and his colonialism did not stick out. So now I hear what you're saying, and you said it in your paper too, that supersessionism was, it didn't have to be newly prominent in the 14th and 15th centuries when the modern concept of race arose with European colonialism and particularly using slaves from sub-Saharan Africa. It was already there. And I think that's your basic point. And yes, I agree it was already there for over a millennium in Spain and Portugal. But if supersessionism is the key to making all these disparate elements, capitalism and nationalism and racialism, stick together, why is it not more central and prominent in the testimonies you give us in these wonderful stories? I mean, those those stories you give us are terrific stories and fascinating stories. But why do we not find supersessionism prominent in their own reasonings? Yes, and I hear what you're saying, and you say it particularly in your book, After Whiteness. Whiteness is a way of seeing and being seen. It affects, it's not just a way of thinking, it's a way of feeling. It affects the feelings. Yes, I get that. That's true. And I also hear what you're saying, that in the 14th, 15th century, suddenly now, Europeans are at the center, as Gentiles had always thought themselves at the center, and Israel marginal. Yes, absolutely. And so you're saying that that's why supersessionism didn't have to be newly prominent. It didn't have to be explicit.
Okay.
Apologies. It's not you, Dr. Lee. There's something about Emery's Zoom account that is not personal.
Yeah. So the three categories: understanding, of the plotting and self-understanding and political task. I absolutely appreciate. I think basically what I'm referring to is when you thinking about political task and plotting, the fact that it's actually not helpful to think about it. I mean, I think there actually is historically the importance of the black and white binary. I always talk about when I teach it, the fact that we have to navigate this thing. It's not something we can go beyond, right? So it's because it's actually to understand history. But at the same time, if you're familiar with the works of your colleagues over at Yale, Lisa Lowe and Gary Yokihiro, it's like, well, it's actually more complicated than that, right? So even as an Asian American, actually Asian American history is actually part of the Pacific and Atlantic trade. There's actually a connection of the continent. So how do you make sure that that doesn't become erased altogether, so that when we talk about Asian American, that's not part of this narrative, right? Something outside of that. Now, is it part of the black and white narrative? Yes, but there actually is a contribution that's being made here. It's not something that can be just assumed in terms of just black and white. That's basically what I'm referring to. The fact that it has a political and a plotting kind of critique set as well. And also the fact that in terms of even, how do you make sure that I particularize all white scholars for their own contextuality? How do I particularize your own perspective and particularize everybody else as particular perspectives? I think it's actually important so that we're not assuming that any of us are talking in a kind of a contextual, ahistorical way. So that's actually one thing. I mean, just the whole idea of making whiteness visible, yeah, absolutely, But I think there's a benefit to something like critical white studies, like nail paintings, painters, history of white people, in the fact that there's a particularizing and a technical way of defining whiteness. And I think that can be beneficial. So that's just my comment as far as that response to Jerry. Dr. McDermott, actually, what I meant was that people tend to think ethnicity is eternal and race is not. And I actually tend to think they're both not eternal in terms of categories, right? In terms of how they're defined, because they keep on changing, right? I think they're both socially constructed and created by people. Now, the categories are not eternal, but the particular ways in which we embody them are eternal. Like I will resurrect with this body in a sense. I will not resurrect in some other body, right? Now that's eternal in that sense, but not in terms of category of like that the national distinctions that we have now will exist forever. That's basically what I mean. There's a distinction here in terms of like the particulars of people and how people embody them, but the categories of nations that we have, like Yugoslavia is gone now, right? So how do you kind of distinguish that? That kind of idea that's not eternal. So that's a distinction I want to make. And then the racial category, it's not so much the fact that, it's not a reduction of Jewishness to a racial category. The fact that it was historically categorized that way is part of the narrative. It's part of the experience. So I think what I want to do is make sure that history becomes part of the experience. Otherwise, if you erase the category and say that it wasn't racial, then you basically end up making that history incomprehensible. So it's not so much the fact that this is actually what it is, but like I said, all identities are a social interaction with how we are presented and how we are framed, as well as what's happening socially. So in this sense, once again, Willie Jennings, Dr. Jennings' categories about how we see ourselves, how we're socially seen, those are all intertwined. It's not easy just to kind of delineate what is truly what it is and what is not. For example, Black identity. I mean, so do we get rid of Black identity? I mean, what would you do with the sense of, all the Black art and everything else? You see in the Third World Liberation Front, the fact that there is a reclaiming and a subjectivity that develops as a part of Blackness or Asian Americanness. So where it was stigmatized, now it's being formed as something that they want to serve for themselves. And so you can't erase that historically, because otherwise you basically end up with nothing. You end up with incomprehensible things. The question is, how do you see the structural oppressive dimensions of it and address these things without saying, well, because racial categories are oppressive, we should stop using them? I mean, that's a historical way of addressing them, I think. Not that you're basically saying that, but I think that's part of the danger. Anyways, I'll stop here.
For the same purpose, I'd like to give Dr. Jennings just a minute or two, and then I see a couple questions from our participants that I'll go to right after that.
Well, I have nothing to really add. I just want to thank Daniel and Jerry once again for their wonderful work. I think we can just go ahead to questions at this point, Holly. It's fine with me.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to read a question that we have from Phil Cunningham, who's well known to those of us who are trying to think about supersessionism and post-supersessionism. He says this: if the Christian imagination over the centuries tended to de-Judaize Jesus and stress his generic ontological human nature, does a Christian effort to relate to Jesus, who of course in the Christian faith transcendently lives today, concretely as a Torah devoted Jew, make it more difficult for Gentile Christians and their concrete diversity to relate to him? Now, this is a question that we do hear, but Dr. Cunningham wants to suggest also that this question would seem to be inextricably related to the racial imagination. So it may be a question that has particular import given our focus today. And he closes by noting that it's an impossible task for quick answers, but just wonders if there are any thoughts from any of our panelists. What does it mean? In what sense does the remembrance of the particularity of Jesus' Jewishness create challenges for those who don't share that identity? And Dr. Cunningham puts it this way: to relate to him.
If I can kind of comment shortly, Holly, is that okay? So
yes.
I think this is a great question, and I think I spent some time on this in my other works that I'm writing. What I see, so Thomas Torrance in his book Mediation of Christ talks about this. He says, what we are really missing the Jewishness of the gospel and Jewish thoughts. What we're trying to do is we're basically making Jesus in Israel. We're separating the embodiment of Israel and kind of the witness that we have into Western culture, Jewish culture, he calls it Oriental culture, whatever, right? So he's like, this is a problem, and we're basically going to lose Jesus. I think he's half right. I think there's an emphasis here that we need to recover, that the particular Jewishness. But this is where the short answer is I just refer to Ken Dusulin's Divine Names in the Holy Trinity. I think that's incredibly helpful in terms of the fact that there actually is a particular Jewishness that we have to recover. There actually is, and so he talks about how do we make sure that we think about ideas of who God is and the divine names in multiple ways that actually includes different cultural kind of ways of thinking about God and engaging culture in a sense. That's basically how I really appreciated it. I think there is an emphasis and a priority, I think, to the biblical witness, but that doesn't limit how the gospel is engaged in different contexts and cultures. And that I think it's really, really important to kind of affirm that.
Other thoughts on that question? Yes, Dr. McDermott.
Yeah, I'm a Gentile and not a Jew. And as Dr. Cunningham asks, does that make it harder for me to relate to him? It makes it a challenge, and perhaps hard in some ways, but more exciting and richer. The more I understand what Jesus's Jewishness involves. Life would be boring if there was no male-female difference. And I would say life, divine life is boring without Jewish-Gentile difference. My wife is very different from me, radically different. She's a woman. And in some ways it's hard to relate to her because she is so different. But the more I understand her, and we've been married 45 years, and there are still things I don't understand. The more I can relate to her, and the more exciting and the richer my relationship to her is. So I would say the same thing about Jesus as a Jew, and particularly because the biblical narrative portrays God's relationship to humanity as a marriage. So marriage is a type of the antitype, the divine-human relationship.
Well, first of all, Jerry, congratulations on 45 years of marriage. That's no small accomplishment.
Thank you.
And Daniel, I want to come back to something you said earlier, which I think is germane to this wonderful question. I very much appreciate the way you talked about the problems of making Jesus an object, the kind of fetishizing of Jesus that removes us from his Jewishness. I think we always want to keep in view the project, the project at the heart of the Jew-Gentile difference, and that is to bring Jew and Gentile together without loss, but gain. And my worry is that, and I talk about this in my commentary on Acts, and in my creation book, I'm working on this. My problem is that there is what comes with supersessionism, and even what's with us with the responses to supersessionism is segregationist thinking. And I worry deeply about the segregationist thinking that we are still so much caught in. Let me explain by that. Because of supersessionism, as Christians, we don't have the imaginative capacity naturally to imagine a way of being together without assimilation, a form of assimilation without loss, without death. Something has to be wiped away if we're going to really enter into each other's lives. And the reality is that's a problem that remains with us. And so much of the conversation about Jew and Gentile relations, Jew and Christian relations, is deeply caught in the problem of segregationist thinking. That it's separate but equal is the only way to survive. And we have to find a way not to deploy Jesus to establish separate but equal thinking. And unfortunately, most of what I hear is really separate but equal thinking, with Jesus as the fulcrum of making that happen.
I want to come back with a specific question that I'm seeing from Jen Rosner, going back to a couple of things that have been talked about. Jen says, I'm intrigued by Dr. Lee's distinction between concrete and essentialist. Could Dr. Lee expand a bit on how this distinction addresses the problem of instrumentalization of Jewish identity?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of essentialist thinking, right? I mean, so I'm drawing from how Orientalism works for Asian Americans, right? So you have an idea, an abstract, eternal idea that doesn't change, right? Eternal idea. And actually, the problem is, in terms of cultural anthropology, when you're trying to find the essence of a people and how cultural anthropology worked, it was that you thought about culture as dead, right? It was actually stuck in time. It never changed. And, realize the fact that in terms of, I think, modern anthropologists thought about cultures and people as static, but we know that that's not true. So how do we make sure that we are thinking about a particular people with its particularities, but the fact that this is not something stuck in time, right? It's actually no people are stuck in time. That's just not true of anybody, right? So, and including Jewish people. So I think, how do we kind of affirm those things is basically what the trick is, whether it be Jewish people or any other people, right? So in that sense, what I mean is there are real people here, right? And what I think when I talk about not only essentialism, but also instrumentalizing or kind of abstracting Jewishness, is that I want to make sure that I talk about Jewish people as though they were in the room. Not like, well, this is basically what they mean. I'm like, what? They're literally in the room, and I can't reduce them to one idea that I want to kind of play with, right? So that's basically what the concern is. And I mean, Jen's a friend, and I've had talked to other Jewish folks, and making sure that I respect who they are in their complexity, in their diversity, right? So you can't define Jewishness in a way so that you actually end up reducing the idea or the identity, so that half the people who are Jewish are not included in that. How do you have a intersectional and multifaceted way of thinking about Jewishness that actually says this is at the intersection of multiple things, and there's a concreteness here. People experience them in particular ways, but I can't boil the whole idea into one thing that I can say, this is what it is. Now, I think theologically and spiritually, yes, it's basically God's election, but there are human particularities here and a particular genealogy that I think I want to affirm. So that's actually how I would talk about this. Hopefully that kind of makes sense, but it makes sense to me. It makes sense for me, at least.
Thank you so much. I have a comment here from Bjorn Louis, who says this: it seems to me that whether supersessionism originated racialism or vice versa is something of a chicken and egg problem. They are at least mutually reinforcing. I'd actually like to turn that into a question and ask whether that is the case. And then I'd like to read a more explicitly articulated question. My question to Dr. Jennings is if he could explain a bit more on the link between the supersessionist and racialist worldview. This is just a small question, Dr. Jennings, and Christian thinking on economics and capitalism, as implicitly affirmed by the French economic scholar Piketty in his latest book, Capitalism and Ideology. I'm sure we could talk about that book for a long time. But could I put both of those questions to you first, Dr. Jennings? Do you think we actually have a chicken here? And then could you say anything about connections to economics? And if you feel able, you could comment on Piketty's book for sure. But
yeah, I'll leave Piketty's book alone for a while. But let's come to this question about chicken and egg. And here's, I think this is the crucial matter. We are not talking about the ways when we're talking about the form of the racial condition that emerges with colonialism. We're not talking about just particular ways of looking at peoples, drawing on the tropes of black and white. What we're talking about is a new reality within which now people who've come to new places are able to make sense of themselves and all the peoples of these new places. And what's crucial to that, which is different, is the transformation of the land. And this is, I think this is what we often lose sight of. So much of the discussion about race is a discussion that ignores the reality of the land. And it ignores the reality of place-centered identities. This continues to be an incredible blind spot for so many Western intellectuals, that for millennia, people actually thought about who they were in relationship to their places. And those places were not just dirt. Those places were a part of them. And that's a new reality, right? Now, here's where we come to the economic reality of it. What are we talking about? We're talking about the creation of private property. And as most historians of capitalism will say, so much of what we understand capitalism to be it fundamentally begins with the change of relations between people and land. It begins with the reorganizing of economies inside a new reality of ownership. So it's at the very heart of these matters. So capitalism forms precisely in the new reality of commodification that has a profound effect on how people will identify themselves or be forced to identify themselves as carrying their identities wholly on their body, because you can no longer get to the land that has defined you, because now not only is it private property, but it's productive private property.
Thank you so much. Can I ask just quickly any other thoughts from either of our other panelists on the relationship between these two? I mean, obviously, Dr. McDermott really addressed this in his proposal. Daniel, Lee, do you have any thoughts about chicken and egg here? Not necessarily.
I mean, supersessionism goes, it's so early, right? So, I mean, we talk about like in terms of like what, 4th century, 2nd century, it's really early. So how do you kind of make sure, and what we're talking about in terms of the modern racial understanding that we're experiencing in the US, and I mean, and actually, I think US should be distinguished, right? Because US and South Africa, we function, how we think about race actually is very different than other parts of the world. And of course, there actually is a broader European kind of coloniality that I think it's important, but it's still different, even in terms of even Canada, right? So I think what I want to say is that the connection that Dr. Jennings was talking about, I definitely see, and it's important. But the modern racial imagination and how it overlaps with supersessionism. Supersessionism has been doing different things in the past. It's older. So that's basically what I would say.
Thank you so much. You know, we're moving toward the end of our time here. I want to just give you a moment. I know that for panelists, this requires really focused concentration over 2 hours. But could I just ask if you have any thoughts at the conclusion, no pressure here, but if you have any thoughts at the conclusion of our session in response, perhaps a point that you'd like to underscore further. If so, we have a moment to make time for that.
I think a short comment from me is that we're talking about global theology, everything global, right? So how we think about the gospel, how we think about Christianities. Supersessionism is literally intertwined with all these ideas. That's basically what I want to say, right? I mean, everybody wants to move toward a global way of thinking about theology. And what's interesting is they talk about cultures, but they leave behind the issues of supersessionism and also Jewishness. because they're following general script that, you know, Dr. Jennings has pointed out, of kind of missiological script. And this is really, really problematic. This is not beneficial. We're losing something here. And so that's basically why I think the work that I'm trying to do, and also other people are kind of, this has to kind of intersect. And that's why I'm so grateful for this discussion we're having here, that it's not just race, it's culture, it's every, of course, when we say race and culture, it's not like it's separate, it's all overlapping, intersecting all together. So we're not talking about, no, this is ethnicity and culture, it's not race. No, it's all the soup, the air that we're talking about. But it must be discussed further. I think the dichotomy between global theologies and how sometimes Jewishness and supersessionism ignore altogether is really, really problematic. So.
Thank you so much. If I could just say a word at the conclusion here, I want to say thank you again to our three panelists. These are issues that are extraordinarily complex and not only important, but urgent. And it's not easy to speak about things that are complex and important and urgent. And I want to thank all three of you again for bringing us, you know, we're well aware that it's your time and reflection that stand behind what you offer to us today. So thank you for giving that to us. I want to say a quick word of apology. I think we had a little bit of a confusion in our session today about which links were offered to which people at which time. I do want to repeat that we will have a recording of this full presentation. So although it's not quite the same thing as participating live, this recording will be available, not right away. It'll take us a little while to make that available, but keep an eye on your email and keep an eye on our social media spots for the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. And of course, as always, I want to say a word of thanks to everyone who's taken part today, who's made this conversation to be what it is. And we look forward to conversations to come in the future. So thank you all. Be well.